And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis showing some thin, lower concentration ice got in and around St. Paul Island here in the last 24 hours. Not going to last very long. Winds are already switched around to the southeast out there, and will turn southwest with warmer temperatures now blow that back to the northeast later tonight and tomorrow. And for today, here's a front bringing the change in the winds and the warmer temperatures into the Pribilofs. Much stronger storm back out there to the west. It'll bring hurricane force winds into the western Aleutians with good storms and gales pushing into the western Bering down to the central Aleutians. High pressure, light winds clearing it out tonight with very cold temperatures below zero from Bristol Bay northward and into the Kuskokwim Valley. Snow showers over the central and eastern interior down to south central Alaska, and more rain for the southern panhandle. And that continues into tomorrow. Wet in the southern southeast coast, drier in the north. High pressure starting to clear it out now into south central Alaska, with showers slowly diminishing on the east side, and the big storm and frontal system bringing increasing snow and blowing snow along the southwest coast all the way up to St. Lawrence Island tomorrow. The main low center staying back to the west there. So the next day, this front really breaks apart and actually kind of splits, with the main push going up into the northwest part of the state and a weaker portion sliding off to the east with just clouds and maybe a chance of some light snow in the Susitna Valley, western Susitna Valley in the afternoon. Another low develops and brings more rain into the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, rain and snow for the Pribilofs. And for the coastal water forecast there for the southern coastal areas, northwest winds 15 to 20 knots for the day on Tuesday, south 15 for Clarence Strait. Central northern interchannel south to southeast winds at 15. Central coast here west at 10 to 15 knots and variable winds, 10 knots for the north coast. And for Wednesday, north winds at 10 for the north coast. Otherwise, the remainder of the coastline here looking at a northwest wind at about 20 knots with 8 to 10 foot seas. Northern or all of the inside waters will see light winds at about 10 knots from either the north or northwest. And for Prince William Sound, small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 knots for Tuesday. And for the North Gulf Coast, north to northwest winds at 20 to 30 knots. Northwest 45 knot winds for the Barren Islands, west winds at 50 knots for Kamishak Bay. Storm warnings there for sure. And for Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. And for Wednesday, variable winds at 10 knots for Cook Inlet. Variable at 10 now for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands as higher pressure moves in. Lightens the winds up. North Gulf Coast, variable to southwest winds at 10 to 15 knots. Prince William Sound, southeast at 10, seas 2 feet. Kodiak Island tomorrow, west-northwest winds at 35 knots. Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, and a light northeast wind at 10 knots for Bristol Bay. And for Wednesday, Kodiak Island, southwest 20 knots, seas 5 feet. And for the Alaska Peninsula, southwest 30 knots with seas 13 feet. Bristol Bay, south at 15, seas 4 feet. And gale warnings for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow. Southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. South 45 knots for Adak and Atka. And hurricane force winds out from Kiska to Shemya for south to southwest winds 65 gusting to 80 knots. And then those drop off markedly here out that way for Wednesday. Southwest 25 to 30 knots there, all the way into Adak and Atka, southwest at 30 knots. Eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, southeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Southeasterlies at 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island. Southeast at 20 for Norton Sound. And for St. Matthew Island, southeast winds 40 knots and gales for the Pribilofs, south at 35 knots. And for Wednesday, good gales continue for St. Lawrence Island, or for St. Matthew Island at 45 knots with seas up to 33 feet. Otherwise, south 25 with 21-foot seas for the Pribilofs, south 25 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, and southwest winds at 30 knots for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, and the coastal areas of the Yukon Delta. Up to the north, starting here in the east, south to south or west southwest winds at 15 knots. Central and western Arctic coast southwest at 20 knots in the Chukchi Sea. South to southeast winds at 15 to 25 knots. And then for Wednesday, for the Chukchi Sea, brisk wind advisories, east to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, east at 15 for the central and western Arctic coast, eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds at 20 knots.